I'm Edward J. Larson. I'm currently serving as one of the inaugural Library Fellows at the spectacular Fred W. Smith National Library for the Study of George Washington at Mount Vernon. You asked me what's notable about the first inauguration of George Washington as President of the United States. Many things. This is a great day. I'm here at Mount Vernon. It's a rainy day here. It's April 30th, 2014, the 225th anniversary of Washington's inauguration as the first president of the United States. It was a unique event because, well, first, America had never had a national president before, a person elected from electors from all the states. The first truly national election, and this was the consummation of that, the conclusion of that. But it was a unique event in many ways for the world because there had never been a popularly elected chief executive for a continental republic. It was a new event, something new. People didn't know what to expect. It was a world of kings. And here there was a presidential inauguration rather than a coronation. Well, Washington had processed from his home in Mount Vernon, where we are now, up to New York, which was then the seat of government for the new incoming government. Congress had already assembled. The vice president, John Adams, had already been sworn in. Washington had a triumphant procession up, stopping in Baltimore and Wilmington and Philadelphia and Trenton. Every place crowds grew. People began to realize that this event itself, having a national president, rather than state senators or members of Congress from different districts, having a national president was itself the most unifying part of the new government under the Constitution. And so by the time he reached New York, the civic leaders there and the leaders in Congress realized they needed to make this a big event. Now, the original plan had called for a quiet swearing-in ceremony. The Constitution provides a short oath that needs to be taken by the incoming president. They had planned that for inside the House chambers in the new Federal Hall. But they realized as this thing grew and thousands of people were lining the streets, 20,000 alone in Philadelphia as he processed through. And when he arrived in New York City a week before the inauguration, there were just crowds everywhere cheering, welcoming him. This was such an important unifying event that they needed a big event to mark it. So they switched the occasion to that he would take the oath of office on an outside balcony overlooking the largest open intersection in New York City, which was the balcony of Federal Hall, that he would give it outside. The place was packed. He had left the executive residence, huge crowds all the way down as he processed down in through the city and then up to Federal Hall. He went in, and when he went out, there were people everywhere. The balconies were full, the rooftops were full, every place everybody could stand to catch a possible glimpse of the new president. He took his oath of office. For the oath of office, he wore, back then, America had very few fine woolen mills, and most people got their clothes from England or France, their fine clothes. Wealthy people did. Washington made a point of getting cloth from a mill in Connecticut, the finest mill then existing in the United States, so he could wear Connecticut broadcloth for his suit when he took office. So he stood there, took the oath of office, and then went in and gave the inaugural address, a short event. He was not a speaker. He gave a brief but powerful address, and then went with Congress to the nearby Episcopal Church for prayers, then back home, and then out that night for an enormous fireworks display. Went on for longer than an hour and lit up the skies over New York City. It was a tremendous day. George Washington's inaugural address was a very short, direct statement almost. He had originally worked with his former aide, David Humphreys, who was a writer of sorts and a poet, with a long, very lyrical address. But when he got to New York City, where he was to be sworn in, he met with, he talked with congressmen there, particularly Congressman James Madison, who was a very close friend, and he talked with him earlier in Mount Vernon about this. And he discarded the long address and instead worked with Madison to get a very short, direct address. Washington really wasn't a speaker. His false teeth had something to do with that. He didn't feel comfortable speaking. In fact, he often talked almost in a very low voice, a hiss, because some would call it, because of his ill-fitting dentures. And his dignity came. Well, John Adams once said that George Washington, who he considered the finest political actor he had ever seen, had the gift of silence. That is, his sheer dignity. He could stand there and convey powerful emotions, basically turn a crowd with a nod or a glare or a look. He had a power of force. So he brought that to the presidential inauguration. But he took this address that was brief, just took a few minutes actually to say, about 20 minutes. And that's reading very slowly because I've read it over and usually I finish it in about 10 or so minutes. So he was reading very slowly if it took 20 minutes. But it did have some pithy lines. It was an address not mainly meant for the audience, which was very small because they were in the Senate chambers and there was only the members of Congress and a few invited guests could hear it. But it was immediately published in newspapers all across America and sent by the ministers from foreign countries back to their home countries to see what was being said about this new country and what America was all about. And there are a variety of lines in there where he calls on the help from God, where he commits himself to service, admits his own inabilities to do this job, which of course was a tremendous understatement. But he had one line that I just want to read to you now because I think it captures, it's certainly the most memorable line from this inaugural address. After expressing his trust in God and Congress to carry the nation forward, Washington reminded Americans of their national purpose. He said, the preservation of the sacred fire of liberty and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply and perhaps finally staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. That is, he realized, and he was speaking out to the American people and to the people of Europe, who were then beginning to undergo Republican revolutions of their own, starting with the French Revolution, which was just beginning now, just beginning at this time. So he was speaking to his own people and to Europe and saying, America has a special destiny here. As he said, the sacred fires of liberty, the destiny of the Republican model of government, as opposed to the monarchical one, which was then dominant, or a tyrannical one, which took place some places. He said, are justly considered as deeply and, note he said, perhaps finally staked on the success of this experiment. That is, the experiment under the Constitution to make a government work. There had been fears before the Constitution was drafted that the states were splitting apart, were breaking apart in their own separate confederations, were fighting with each other over economic matters and borders. And the whole experiment seemed to be collapsing. There was a thought that Spain would take over the West and England would come back, and the whole experiment, as he called it, was going to collapse. And with it, the ideal of Republican government. And he's saying, no, we've got to make this work. This Constitution is our last best chance to make this ideal, this possibility of Republican government on which he had staked his life and his fortune in the Revolutionary War, and so many of the people who were hearing him had done the same. That was staked on this and making it work. That's why he had come out of retirement from Mount Vernon. That's why he was back in New York, and that's why he was taking over the presidency, and that's the charge he was putting on the members of Congress, his incoming administration, and the American people. 225 years have passed since the inauguration of President Washington for the first time. That's 225 years of government under the Constitution. It's a notable anniversary, a notable event. Significant in part because it lasted so long. When Washington gave his inaugural address, he said he knew he was speaking to a people who doubted, and a world that doubted if this American experiment was even going to work. Even others who thought it might work for a while felt that the government would have to change periodically. It has changed, but it has not changed as in other countries through revolution and upheaval. It has changed through evolution. And the Constitution and its understanding and its uses have been able to adapt to the tremendous changes. But what those people had started, what Washington had started as president of the Constitutional Convention, what the states had started by ratifying the Constitution, and what Washington started, along with that first Congress, in New York, when they started this new country, when that new government got going, and Washington as its leader, as president, was centrally important to that. What they got going then has endured now for 225 years. That itself is remarkable and notable. Now, people knew this was a special event. And in some ways, Washington being sworn in as president started the new government. Congress had already started meeting a few weeks before. Even the vice president had been sworn in. But in so many ways, the people were connecting this new government with the presidency. That's not something the founders initially assumed. They thought it'd be a government of the Congress. But what became the unifying force of the country was the presidency, and that had been captured in an article in the leading New York newspaper the day before. Now, this today is as you mentioned, the 225th anniversary. This is April 30th. And that date of the date of the swearing in was April 30th, 1789. But a day before, that New York newspaper, and I think it captures it, what they were expecting. In some ways, well, we now know Washington's inauguration was significant because it launched this new government that has lasted for 225 years and counting. But people knew it was important at the time. They had anticipated, they put the weight on it that it has come to realize. And I think in many ways this was captured by a newspaper article the day before the inauguration. New York's leading newspaper at that time, perhaps one of the leading newspapers in the United States, certainly, was the Gazette of the United States. And it ran a bold-faced editorial on April 29, 1789, the day before the inauguration. And that editorial sort of captures it all. It said, and I'll read from it, "We have heard much about the birthday of our Columbia." Columbia meaning the new country, the United States. It was a shorthand for it. "We have heard much about the birthday of our Columbia." That, of course, was the 4th of July. "Tomorrow," the editorial says, "tomorrow is the day of her espousals." That is, the United States' espousals. "When, in the presence of the King of Kings, the solemn compact will be ratified between her," that is, the people of the United States, "and the darling object of her choice. Washington," the paper exclaimed, "by universal suffrage of a great and various people, would become president." Now, that captures the spirit that how much this country's founding, this country's establishment, was tied in with an elected national president, the first and only officer chosen across state lines from the entire country. And that person who was already glorious from his victories in the Revolution, being sworn in as president, marked in many ways, well, as the paper said, the culmination, the marriage of the people with the country. So we've heard about the birthdays. Now this is, well, as the paper was saying, the wedding day. We now have a union, and that union has lasted now for 225 years and counting.